If you want to impress the examiner in this year's A-level politics exams, then you need to be using recent examples from the past year of UK politics. Here are 5 key examples from the past year to use in the Paper 1 exam in just 10 days' time. Okay, so this first example is one you can use for the rights in context topic and the pressure groups topic. And it's the court case R. Amori versus Secretary of State for the Home Department. And what it kind of was about was the Palestine Action, a direct action pressure group, which they weren't a terrorist group. They hadn't killed anyone. They had kind of damaged military planes in RAF Bryce Norton. They were designated under the Terrorism Act. They were prescribed as a kind of terrorist group by the Home Secretary in late 2025. And this case was brought to the court by Amori, deputy leader of Palestine Action, with support from Liberty and Amnesty International, 2 other key pressure groups that support rights in the United Kingdom, and they provided evidence to the court. And they effectively argued that the prescription of Palestine Action as a terrorist group was the Home Secretary acting beyond their powers, and that it undermined the right to protest, because after they were prescribed as a terrorist group, over 800 peaceful protesters were arrested in just one day, only for holding up signs saying, "I support Palestine Action." So they're effectively arguing this decision to prescribe a group which hadn't killed anyone, had just damaged property, as a terrorist group was ultra vires. It was beyond the powers, and the Home Secretary had kind of acted against the law effectively. And in this court case, the High Court sided with Amori, sided with Palestine Action, and arguing that the prescription of a group that only targets property rather than people effectively as a terrorist group undermines the rights of freedom of speech and rights of assembly in the United Kingdom. So a really good example, firstly, of how pressure groups can use legal challenges to achieve their goals, including you can bring in the examples of Palestine Action, but also how they were supported by Amnesty International and Liberty. But also a good example of how the courts are effective at protecting rights in the United Kingdom. So you could use an example that the government is ineffective at protecting rights because they undermined the right to protest and the right of assembly, but how the courts and how pressure groups through legal challenges can be effective at protecting rights. So a really good example for those 2 topics. The next example, on the other hand, is an example of a failure of pressure groups, and that's the British Medical Association and the failure of their strikes, their trade union action effectively. So in December 2025, the BMA, the British Medical Association, announced a round of strikes in England. And this was their 14th round of strikes since March 2023. And of course, as their doctors, it caused significant disruption in hospitals, effectively. It followed the fact that the group, the British Medical Association and doctors, had rejected an offer of 83% kind of pay rise by the government, and they effectively were trying to secure further pay rises but they were kind of unsuccessful effectively. They were unsuccessful due to weak public support and the government not supporting them effectively. Wes Streeting, the health secretary, described their demands as a fantasy, and a YouGov poll in December 2025 found that 58% of the public strongly opposed their industrial action. So this is a really good example of how pressure groups that use outsider methods, so BMA you could describe as an insider group, could describe as an outsider pressure group, but here they're very much using outsider methods of industrial action, of striking, are often unsuccessful if they fail to gain public support. If they're not supported by the government and they're not aligned with the government's interests, and they're not supported by the public, they're unlikely to be listened to by the government. So a really good example there of pressure group failure. This next key example is one you can use for policy similarity between Labour and the Conservative parties, of Labour Party policy, but also of the influence of minor parties in British politics. And that's of Labour's shift to the right on immigration. So in their kind of nearly 2 years now of being in power since the 2024 election, Labour have shifted significantly to the right on immigration, including in March of this year, when Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood announced changes, including the fact that refugee status will become temporary and subject to review every 2.5 years, rather than the previous 5 5-year right to remain. It's a significant shift to the right on immigration. So you can use this firstly in relation to Labour Party policy, of how they've kind of shifted to the centre or to the right, and how this is actually quite different from both old Labour and New Labour, both of which were quite encouraging of immigration. For example, under the New Labour governments of Tony Blair, there was significant immigration every year, effectively. You can also use an example of policy similarity, because that brings them closer to the Conservative Party, who have had a kind of quite right-wing immigration policy for a long time. But finally, you can use it as an example of the influence of minor parties. The main reason that Labour have shifted to the right on immigration, including this key reform earlier this year, is that Reform are now the most popular party in British politics. We saw that recently in the local elections, but they've been polling for months and months, and nearly a year now, at around 25% of the vote, making them the most popular party in polling in the United Kingdom. And clearly a big reason for their support is they're very right-wing on immigration. They also support scrapping indefinite leave to remain. They support leaving the European Convention on Human Rights and scrapping the Human Rights Act to make it easier to kind of effectively deport illegal immigrants, and they've said that they kind of freeze non-essential immigration. So because they're gaining such support due to this kind of right-wing harsh immigration policies, particularly in relation to illegal immigration, what you've seen is Labour, they're worried that they're losing a lot of support and a lot of votes to Reform, so they've shifted to the right on immigration to stop losing support. And this is a really good example of how the threat of the kind of spoiler effect, or the threat of losing votes and losing an election, can allow minor parties like Reform to have a major influence on policy in British politics, even if they're not in government. Reform are setting the agenda because of their popularity and therefore influencing policy, even if they're not in government yet. The next key recent example you can use is in relation to party membership, and this is the growth in party membership of minor parties in British politics. In particular, the fact that Reform now have the most party members of any party in British politics, with over 270,000 members in May 2026. More than the Labour Party, who are estimated to be around kind of 250,000 members, whilst the Green Party have also significantly increased their membership. It's estimated that in May 2026, they have over 230,000 members as well. Again, almost the same as the Labour Party, and significantly more than the Conservative Party, who are estimated to kind of have around 100,000, 120,000 members. And you can use this in two key ways. First of all, in relation to an essay on the participation crisis. You can use it as really good evidence that there isn't a participation crisis in British politics, because there's still significant participation and support for these minor parties. Yes, there's decreased membership for the major parties, but people are still engaged in politics and political parties when they feel they can make a real change or make a difference, which these minor parties arguably offer, by offering something different to Labour and the Conservative parties. And you can also use as an example, for example, in an essay on whether there's a multi-party system or whether minor parties matter in British politics, you might do a paragraph on party funding and membership, and you can use this as really good evidence the argument that potentially now is a multi-party system and minor parties do matter in British politics. Not only does this show active participation and engagement, it also is likely to kind of translate effectively to significant funding, because party membership costs to be a member of a political party. For example, for Reform, I think it's around £25 per year effectively. So that's going to translate to significant funding for Reform UK, allowing them then to challenge the major parties in elections. And the final example is that of the media having a significant impact in holding the government to account between elections. And this is in relation to Peter Mandelson, and a number of different newspapers or outlets played a key role here. Press reporting from the BBC and the Telegraph played an important role in revealing that Peter Mandelson had kind of passed market-sensitive information to sex offender Jeffrey Epstein while serving as a minister under New Labour. And this led to a parliamentary move requiring the government to release up to 100,000 documents, and ultimately in the resignation of Starmer's Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, as well. Whilst in April 2026, The Guardian reported that Mandelson had failed his security vetting, contradicting Keir Starmer. So a really good example of the media holding the government to account between elections. For loads more examples like this, go to the Politics Explained website and purchase our up-to-date recent example pack.